Don't expect a single dime from Dad's $92 million. That was the very first thing my son Daniel spat out at the will reading. I still remember how his face drained of color when the lawyer read my name among the beneficiaries. As if he couldn't believe that I am Margaret Holloway, gray-haired, frail, still standing, was still alive, still holding a place in this house. She's still breathing? I thought she'd be gone by now. Maybe we should check her pulse when they read the will. Before I go any further, I want to ask you, the ones listening to my story. Where are you from? Where are you living now? Leave a comment and let me know the corners of the world my voice has reached. And if you've ever faced unfairness in your own family, don't forget to subscribe, so that voices like mine, voices often buried or ignored, will never be silenced again. Every word from my son cut like ice. I still smelled faintly of the roses from Richard's funeral the day before. They had barely shoveled earth over his grave, and already they gathered here, not to mourn, not to remember, but to feast and carve up his fortune. The hallway that once smelled of polished wood and displayed family portraits now echoed with footsteps, with laughter, with cold negotiations. I gripped the stair railing, the same one Richard once polished by hand, and watched as my children and grandchildren circled like vultures. This one's mine. Andrew, my grandson, slapped a neon sticky note onto the grandfather clock, then the leather armchair, then the wedding china cabinet. He moved as if he were in a showroom, claiming prizes he never earned. Sophie, my granddaughter, walked slowly with her phone out, an app measuring the walls. Once she's gone, we'll remodel this into a spa room. Or maybe a wine-tasting nook. Needs better lighting. Her voice was flat, clinical, as if I were already a ghost. Linda, my daughter-in-law, appeared with a tray of champagne flutes, smiling brightly. We're celebrating Dad's legacy, she declared. He built an empire, and now it's our turn to carry it forward. Someone muttered, and sweep out the ghosts. Laughter erupted. My usual chair at the dining table had been replaced with a folding chair from the garage, its leg wobbling. They told me to sit in the mudroom. You'll be more comfortable there, away from the noise. So I found myself alone, across from a mop bucket and a broken broom, with a paper plate of dry chicken and cold potatoes. From the other room I heard them. This house smells like mothballs and death. We'll strip the wallpaper, gut the kitchen. Andrew peeled another sticker and slapped it onto the sideboard beside me. This one's mine, he said, grinning like a boy winning carnival prizes. I held my teacup tightly with both hands to stop the trembling. Then came another voice. Dad always said she'd die before him. Guess that was his only mistake. She made soup. He built an empire. Laughter roared again. Let her rot with her memories, sneered a cousin. Can we keep her pension checks if we just forward the mail? Joked one granddaughter. She's half dead already. Just give her the garden shed, another voice chimed in. I bit into the cold chicken. It was dry as chalk. No one noticed. No one waited for me to speak. But inside the pocket of my sweater, my fingers brushed the crisp edge of a document I had kept safe for 15 years. A notarized bank memorandum with my name, not as dependent, not as witness, but as co-founder and early investor in the family trust. Written in blue ink, not black. A small detail, but in court, small details can turn the tide. They didn't know. They had never asked. They never cared that when the company teetered on the edge of collapse, I sold every piece of heirloom jewelry. My mother's emerald necklace, my wedding bangles, even the brooch I wore the night Richard proposed. I wired the money quietly, told him only one thing: use it. But don't ever let them know it came from me. He never said a word. He kept that promise. And now, none of those laughing voices in the other room had the slightest idea that it was me who saved everything. They thought I was nothing more than an old shadow in a corner. But I knew better. I was still alive. I still had a voice. And I still held a secret, one that the Holloway family had never imagined. I sat there, listening to the laughter spilling from the living room, but my mind drifted backward, to the years when everything the Holloway family owned nearly crumbled to dust. It was 15 years ago. Richard's company, still fragile back then, stood at the edge of collapse. I remember the way he came home late at night, his tie loosened, his hands trembling, his eyes downcast with shame. He didn't need to say a word. I already knew. The bank had called, the contracts were gone, bankruptcy hovered like a storm cloud. Just one deal, Richard muttered, staring into the fireplace as though the flames could burn away his despair. If I can close, the investors in New York will survive. But I need collateral. Money I don't have, pride I can't set aside. He didn't look at me. Pride wouldn't let him. Pride demanded that he carry the weight alone, even as it threatened to crush him. That night, when he finally slept, I sat at my vanity and opened the small hidden drawer. Inside were the last relics of my youth and my mother's legacy. The diamond earrings from our wedding night, the emerald ring passed down for generations, the heavy gold bangles I wore as a bride, the hairpin my mother gave me at our engagement. Each piece carried memory. Each piece carried weight. But I knew, if I didn't act, the company would collapse and Richard would break. Quietly I gathered them all. At dawn, I walked into the jeweler's shop, sold every last treasure and took the check straight to the bank. The transfer went through to the company's account within the hour. I left Richard only a note: use it. But never tell them where it came from. He kept that promise. Not once did he reveal it. And in return, the deal in New York was signed. The company breathed again. People called him a genius, a visionary, a self-made man. They raised glasses in his honor. They wrote headlines about his brilliance. No one asked where the lifeline had come from. No one thought to look behind him at the woman who had quietly given everything. I remember the day of the IPO launch. A banner draped across the lobby with bold black letters: "Legacy built alone." I smiled faintly, bit my lip and turned away. I told myself a family only needs one hero. Better, I thought, to let him have the title. But silence has consequences. The more I stepped back, the more they believed I was never there at all. They began to rewrite the story. He built an empire and I built soup. It's not just my story. Across America, millions of women my age lived the same fate. I once read a statistic. More than 60% of older American women have sacrificed careers, savings, or inheritance for their families, yet few are ever recognized. Their names vanish from documents. Their labor disappears into someone else's achievements. They are labeled homemakers, as if that title erases the empires built on their sacrifices. I was one of them. Late one night, while the house slept, I drafted the IPO proposal Richard had been struggling with for weeks. He couldn't find the words. My background in commerce before marriage had never truly left me. I laid out a multi-phase expansion plan, projected shareholder value, and tied it all to a reform in the supply chain. But I didn't sign my real name. I used a pen name, sealed the proposal in an envelope and mailed it to the company office. 2 nights later, over dinner, Richard mentioned an anonymous proposal that had landed on his desk. "It's brilliant," he laughed. "Even the handwriting looks like yours." I only smiled and kept stirring the soup. That proposal became the backbone of the IPO launch, bringing in millions. The company hailed his ingenuity. A plaque was hung in the lobby, etched with the words, "Inspired by ingenuity." His ingenuity. But I told myself it didn't matter. That quiet sacrifice was noble. That silence was strength. That's what women of my generation were taught. To disappear gracefully, to stand behind the curtain and feel proud of it. Yet silence too long becomes erasure. Now 15 years later, I sat in the mudroom, listening to my grandchildren slap neon notes on my furniture, mocking me as the woman who made soup. They didn't know the nights I spent writing by lamplight. They didn't know the jewelry I sold or the choices I made. Without me, there would be no empire to inherit. I swallowed hard, tightened my grip on the document in my pocket. That notarized bank memorandum. The proof that my name was written into the foundation of this family's fortune. For the first time in years, I felt my pulse strong and steady. It was time. Time to break the silence. That night, while the others toasted wine and laughed in the dining room, I moved slowly toward the staircase. Upstairs, I could hear drawers yanked open, closet doors creaking, the wheels of suitcases rolling across the floorboards. They were tearing through the bedroom Richard and I had shared for decades. "That room is ours now," I heard Linda say, her voice sharp as glass. "She can move to the little space downstairs. Technically it's a utility room," she added with a laugh, "but a cot will fit just fine." They didn't call it the laundry room. They dressed it up with words like utility space. But I knew the truth. I had washed thousands of loads of clothes in that room, scrubbed the tiles until my knees ached, breathed in the chemical tang of bleach. Now it was to be my bedroom. At the foot of the stairs sat my suitcase, shoved against the wall. Cardboard boxes stacked beside it, each labeled with a cruel stroke of marker. Old stuff. donation. And one that cut like a blade, Grandma's junk. I bent down and found a cracked photo frame. It was from our 30th anniversary. Richard with his arm around me, both of us smiling beneath the rose arbor he had planted with his own hands. Back then the house still felt like ours. Now the picture had been tossed into a box like rubbish. When I stepped into the laundry room, the smell of mildew and bleach nearly knocked me back. A rusted utility sink in one corner. A plastic mop bucket in another. And against the wall, a folding cot with a faded blanket, thin and stiff as cardboard. A flickering bulb overhead sputtered weakly, mocking the space I was meant to call mine. Andrew poked his head in, smirking. If we keep her address, we can still cash her pension checks. Laughter followed him down the hall. I said nothing. At my age, I should have been sitting at the head of the table, treated with respect, not exiled to a corner with mop handles and detergent fumes. But in America I am not alone. Reports show that 1 in 3 widowed women over 65 ends up pushed to the margins. Financially dependent, stripped of dignity, often treated as a burden by the very children they once raised. I was no different. I had built this home with my hands, sewn the curtains, cooked every meal, kept it alive through decades of storms and struggles. Yet now, every memory was plastered with neon stickers reading, "This one's mine." As if kindness could be erased. As if sacrifice could be itemized and auctioned off. That night, while they feasted on steak and wine upstairs, I sat alone on the cot, prying open a can of soup I had hidden away. No opener had been left for me. I used the edge of a key. Their mocking words returned. She built soup. As I had built soup. But soup had kept them alive. Soup had warmed winters, healed sicknesses, and given Daniel, my son who now turned against me, the strength to rise from failure as a boy. They laughed because they thought nourishment was nothing. They forgot that behind every so-called empire stood a woman who built warmth out of nothing. I lay back on the cot, staring at the mold-stained ceiling. I clutched the cracked anniversary photo to my chest. Richard's smile still shone faintly through the broken glass. And somewhere deep inside I heard a whisper rise. "Margaret, you are still here. And you are not finished yet." That night, for the first time in years, I didn't cry. I didn't feel broken. I only waited for morning, when I would pull out the leather folder hidden beneath the loose floorboard in this very room. The next morning, as pale sunlight slipped through the crack of the laundry room door, I sat up with the document in my hands. Not just one, but an entire bundle of papers I had hidden for years. I knelt on the cold tile, pried up the loose floorboard only I knew about, and pulled out an old leather folder. Inside were pages yellowed with time, a notarized bank memorandum, an investment certificate, and the original draft of the IPO strategy, written in my own hand. My fingertips brushed the ink. Slightly smudged in places but unmistakable. And there it was. My name, Margaret Holloway, not as dependent, not as witness, but as co-founder and co-owner. I knew then the time had come. I wrapped my worn cardigan around my shoulders, clutched the folder close, and stepped out into the chilly morning air. The sidewalks still glistened with dew. A few blocks away stood the payphone outside the pharmacy, the same phone I had once used to call Richard when he traveled. My hands trembled, but I pressed the numbers I still remembered by heart. A deep, familiar voice answered. "Collins speaking." "It's time," I said simply. He didn't ask what I meant. He only replied, "Come to my office tomorrow." Mr. Collins had been Richard's lawyer for decades, but long before marriage turned into performance, he had also been mine. He knew my silence wasn't weakness. He knew I had a mind of my own. The next day I walked into his office. The smell of polished wood and the warmth of amber light greeted me, and for the first time in years, I felt as though my presence mattered. I placed the folder gently on his desk, opening each document in turn. "This," I began, pointing to the certificate, "is the bank memorandum, signed and notarized, confirming my contribution. Here, the co-ownership agreement with my name beside Richard's. And this," I slid forward the stack of handwritten pages curled at the edges, "is the original IPO proposal written by me." Collins read slowly, his brows knitting together. Finally he looked up. "You wrote this?" I nodded. "I didn't sign my real name. I sent it under a pen name. Richard took it, presented it, and they all believed it was his." Collins was silent for a long while. Then he pulled out a thin envelope from his drawer. Inside was a copy of that very proposal bearing the same pseudonym, Al Hartwell. He compared the handwriting, then immediately called in a handwriting specialist. For 2 hours I sat as they traced each loop, each pressure point, each hesitation of ink. At last the specialist set down the papers and declared, "A perfect match." Collins exhaled, his tone firm. "Under federal intellectual property law, this is considered an invention. Because it was never legally transferred, authorship and copyright default back to you, Margaret. Do you understand? The royalties alone over 15 years could amount to tens of millions." I didn't smile. I didn't even feel triumph. I only breathed out, slow and steady. "I don't want all of it," I said quietly. "I want my voice back." Collins leaned back, studying me with a respect few had ever shown me. He understood. What I sought wasn't revenge nor fortune. It was recognition. Women my age were always told, silence is virtue, sacrifice is duty. And so we disappeared willingly behind curtains, behind kitchens, behind our husbands' shadows. But what no one asked was, if we all stay silent, how many lives, how many ideas, how much brilliance is erased forever? I pressed the folder to my chest. For the first time in years I felt visible. Tomorrow at the will reading they would look at me and laugh. They would treat me as a ghost. But this time I would enter that room with a heart steady and a truth they could not erase. The day of the will reading arrived. I wore my old beige coat, the one they had mocked last Christmas as depressing old lady attire. Outside, the sky was gray, rain misting against the glass windows of the law office. Inside, everything gleamed with cold perfection. Glass walls, polished black leather chairs, the sterile scent of disinfectant. No warmth, no memory of home. Daniel sat at the front, his legs crossed, his wedding ring glinting. Linda leaned in, whispering something that made him smirk. "She'll be dead before Christmas anyway. Don't expect a dime for her," he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. Andrew, my grandson, scribbled his signature again and again on a notepad, as though rehearsing for the moment he would sign away my life. Sophie tapped furiously at her phone under the table. Not one of them looked at me. I sat at the far end on a folding chair, so different from their padded leather thrones it might as well have been a mark of exile. Then Mr. Collins entered. Briefcase in hand, shoulders square, he carried the weight of finality in his every step. His presence quieted the room. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady. "Today we execute the final wishes of Mr. Richard Holloway, as set forth in his legally binding will." Daniel leaned back, a flicker of smugness still in his eyes. Linda straightened her scarf, proud and expectant. Andrew whistled softly as though this were a game. Collins set a small silver recorder on the table, pressed a button, and suddenly the room filled with Richard's voice. Slower than I remembered, heavier with age, but clear, calm, and deliberate. "If my son Daniel ever speaks ill of his mother, deduct $1 million per word." The air collapsed. It was as if every breath had been sucked from the room. Daniel's face drained white. "What?" he burst out, shoving back his chair. "That's not real. Dad would never." Collins raised one hand, calm as stone. He slid a transcript across the table. "Verified recording. Home security system. Kitchen. 3 days after the funeral." He began to read aloud. 1. She's still breathing? Thought she'd be gone by now. 2. Maybe check her pulse at the will reading. 3. She built soup. He built an empire. Each sentence fell like a hammer. My heart clenched with every word, but not for me. This time the sting landed squarely on Daniel. Linda's voice cracked. "How many statements?" Collins looked directly at them. 88. That equals $88 million deducted from Daniel Holloway's inheritance. The sound of a pen dropping echoed in the silence. Daniel stared at the table, his lips moving soundlessly, stripped of words. I sat still, hands folded, my breath steady. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. For the first time in years I felt the weight of justice shift. Not loudly, not violently, but undeniably. Somewhere, I knew, countless women like me sat in cold rooms across America, dismissed and disrespected by the very families they had built. But here in this moment a husband's voice, late though it was, rose to defend the woman who had kept him alive. And it was louder than any mockery, stronger than any laughter. I lifted my eyes to Daniel. His hands trembled, his mouth opening in protest that never came. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply sat in quiet recognition. The truth finally had begun to speak. The room remained frozen after Collins announced the deductions from Daniel's inheritance. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, the silence itself speaking louder than I ever could. But Collins wasn't finished. He turned a page, his tone calm yet cutting. And now, he said, the most critical part. According to the revised and fully notarized will, the primary beneficiary of all remaining assets, including the trust, the investment portfolio, real estate, and intellectual property rights. He paused. I heard my own heartbeat in my ears. Daniel's eyes narrowed with fury. Linda's hand tightened around his arm. Andrew leaned forward in his chair, hungry for the words. Will go to the wife of Richard Holloway, Mrs. Margaret Holloway. The room erupted. Linda shot to her feet, her voice shrill. Impossible. She was just the wife. Richard built all of this. He would never. Collins lifted a hand, his voice slicing through the chaos. I'm afraid you're mistaken. We have legal proof. This is the notarized bank memorandum from 15 years ago, confirming an initial investment deposited by Margaret Holloway herself. This is the co-founder agreement with her signature alongside Richard's. And this, he held up a stack of yellowed papers, ink fading but clear, is the original IPO proposal that saved Holloway Industries from bankruptcy. Not written by Richard. Written by Margaret. The silence was heavy as stone. Daniel's lips moved but no sound came out. Sophie's phone clattered to the floor with a sharp crash. Andrew blinked rapidly, his mouth hanging open. Collins pressed on. We submitted these documents for forensic handwriting analysis. The results confirmed with 100% certainty that Margaret is the author. Under U.S. federal intellectual property law, authorship and copyright default to her. Which means, every royalty generated over the last 15 years belongs to her, not to the company. Linda crumpled back into her chair. Daniel slammed his fist onto the polished table, shouting, No. My father wrote that. He built the empire. She made soup and sewed curtains. She could never. This time I lifted my head. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a blade. Yes, I made soup. But those bowls of soup kept you alive, Daniel. They carried you through winters, through sickness, through rejection. And I also wrote. I also invested. I also saved this family. Without me, there would be no empire for you to squabble over. The words hung in the air. The rain tapped against the window pane, the only sound in the room. Then Collins unfolded a smaller envelope and drew out a letter. Before his passing, he said, Richard left this message for his wife. He cleared his throat and read slowly. Margaret, forgive me for letting your light be hidden so long. I never forgot. If they cannot see it, let this will speak for me. You built this with me. Now let the world know your name. My throat tightened. Not because of joy, but because, after all these years, my name was finally spoken in the very legacy I had carried on my shoulders. I thought of the countless women like me, erased from stories they helped write, denied a place in the empires they helped build. And yet here in this sterile, glass-walled office, I felt proof at last. Truth can be buried, but it cannot be erased. I clenched the letter in my hands. For the first time in years, I lifted my chin and looked around at my stunned family. And I knew they would never erase me again. After Collins finished reading the letter, the room sank into a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. No one dared breathe too loudly. Outside, the rain drummed against the glass, as if it were burying the lies that had poisoned this family for years. Then Daniel shot to his feet, his face red with fury, his eyes burning. He jabbed a finger at me. You lied your whole life. You're nothing but a woman who made soup. How could you possibly write those plans? This is a fraud. Linda clutched his arm, but her eyes blazed with the same fire. We'll sue. We'll overturn this. There's no way a housewife in a kitchen could have saved an entire company. Andrew sat frozen, his eyes darting back and forth, stunned into silence. He stared at the documents on the table as though they were written in a language he could not understand. Sophie bent down to pick up her phone from the floor, her hands trembling too hard to switch it back on. Collins remained steady, his tone unwavering. You can sue if you wish, Mr. Holloway. But the law does not operate on insults or disbelief. It operates on evidence. And the evidence is here. I looked at my son, the boy I had once cradled, the young man I had comforted when he wept over his college rejection. Now he stood before me shaking with rage, a grown man reduced to a child clutching for toys. My heart ached, but not from pity. From clarity. He had never truly seen me. Slowly I rose to my feet. The scrape of the folding chair against the floor echoed like thunder in the stillness. I let my eyes sweep across the room, meeting each stunned face. My voice was not loud, but it carried with unshakable weight. Yes, I stood in the kitchen. Yes, I made soup. I sewed curtains, I kept the hearth alive. But I also signed papers, sold my jewelry, and wrote the words that kept Holloway Industries alive. I built alongside Richard, not behind him, beside him. And you buried me as if I never existed. No one answered. Linda pressed her lips together. Daniel looked away. Andrew lowered his head, and Sophie's quiet sob broke the silence. I drew a deep breath and continued. My generation of women were told that silence was virtue, that sacrifice was duty, that standing behind a man was noble. But those beliefs buried countless minds, countless sacrifices, countless legacies. I stayed silent too long. But today I will not be silent again. Collins gave a small nod. He understood. He saw in me not just an old Holloway widow, but a woman of intellect, of worth, of undeniable presence. The room held its breath. I placed my hand firmly on the folder before me, a declaration as clear as any words. This is the proof. This is the truth. And this is the voice I am reclaiming. The rain outside struck harder, as though in agreement. Inside, not a single soul could find words to challenge me. The air in the room had grown so heavy it felt suffocating. Daniel still stood, his fists clenched, veins bulging at his temples. Linda whispered something in his ear, but I saw her eyes, no longer fiery with confidence but clouded with fear. It's all fake. Daniel shouted one last time, but his voice cracked. No one echoed him. No one defended him. Even Andrew and Sophie, who had been laughing the loudest before, now sat with heads bowed, unable to meet my eyes. Linda finally let go of Daniel's arm, exhaling sharply. You've ruined everything. All these years we lived off this legacy, and now, her voice broke. She turned away, ashamed to look at the others. I knew then that cracks in their marriage had split wide open and nothing could mend them now. I rose from my chair and walked slowly toward the door. Each step echoed across the polished floor, steady and deliberate. They watched me, but no one dared to speak. Perhaps in that moment they no longer saw me as the invisible old woman they had mocked. They saw me as a woman who had reclaimed the truth, and they could not deny it. I paused beside Daniel. He would not look at me, his eyes bloodshot with rage and humiliation. I spoke softly just for him. You forgot one thing. The truth does not need permission to exist. Then I turned and walked away. Outside, the rain had eased, leaving only the damp scent of the pavement. I pulled my coat close and breathed deeply. What I felt was not triumph, not revenge, only peace. After years buried under mockery and silence, I had finally stepped into the light. Not because of luck, not because of mercy, but because I had held on to proof and because I had refused to forget. At my age, I no longer needed wealth. What I needed was something greater: dignity, recognition, and the right to have my name remembered. I thought of the countless women still out there, erased from the very stories they helped build, still hidden behind closed doors and forgotten sacrifices. And I wanted my story to be a reminder. Silence too long becomes erasure. And at some point we must be the ones to rise and claim our place. I stepped forward with my head held high, leaving behind a room drowning in silence, where those who had once dismissed me as a shadow were forced to face a truth they could never bury again. When I left the law office, the rain had stopped. The gray sky had opened just enough to let a weak band of sunlight spill across the puddled streets. I pulled my old beige coat tighter around me, walking slowly toward the waiting car. Not one member of the family followed. They were still trapped in that glass room, choking on the silence of defeat. When I arrived home, I paused at the gate. The grand house that had held my life for decades no longer felt like a home. It loomed before me like a museum, filled with relics of memories, but stripped of the warmth that gave them meaning. I pressed my palm to the familiar wooden door, and in a rush I remembered the first day Richard and I moved in. We had almost nothing then, only a handful of old furniture and an unshakable belief that this house would witness a lifetime of happiness. I stepped inside. The silence was thick, as if the house itself had endured the storm with me. I walked through the hallway where a small scratch still scarred the wall, the mark Daniel left as a boy when his toy car crashed into it. Back then I cried over it, thinking it ruined the paint forever. Now it reminded me there was once joy and laughter echoing through these rooms. In the living room, the curtains I had sewn myself still hung, their fabric faded but intact. I remembered every stitch I made under lamplight, determined to make the space beautiful so Richard could welcome guests with pride. On the bookshelf, a few old novels gathered dust. I picked one up and opened it, inhaling the faint scent of paper, remnants of nights I had sat waiting for Richard to come home, long after the children were asleep. I stopped in the kitchen. The old iron pot sat on the counter, the one I had used for countless bowls of soup, mocked by them as trivial as nothing. I smiled sadly. They had forgotten that those bowls were the foundation of their lives, the nourishment that held the family together. They laughed at soup, but they never understood that soup was survival. I climbed the stairs to the master bedroom. The bed was neatly made, the linens cold and untouched. I opened the closet and found one of Richard's coats still hanging there. I pressed a hand to my chest and closed my eyes. For a moment I could almost hear his voice again. "I'm grateful, Margaret. But let me carry the glory." My lip trembled. For so many years I had accepted that bargain, to stand behind him in the shadows. But shadows cannot bury truth forever. I gathered photographs, a few letters, and the cracked anniversary frame I had once held in the laundry room. I placed them gently in a small box. These were the things that mattered. Not the house, not the walls, but the memories woven through them. Sitting down in the quiet, I realized something. This house, once the symbol of love and resilience, now only echoed with greed and mockery. Keeping it would not comfort me. It would only wound me again and again. I reached for the phone and dialed Collins. His steady voice answered. "I want to sell the house," I said simply. "Not because I need the money. Because I need freedom." There was a pause. Then he replied, "I'll handle everything, Margaret." I leaned back, closing my eyes. What washed over me was not grief but release. The house had served its purpose. It was time for me to move forward. People often say the elderly cling to the past, to houses, to keepsakes, to walls steeped in memory. But I think the opposite. At my age, I understand more than ever. What truly remains is not in bricks or wood. It is in the heart, in the truth, in the memories I carry no matter where I go. I opened the window. The wind after the rain rushed in, carrying the scent of wet earth and faint roses from the garden. I smiled. For the first time in years, the air felt clean. Tomorrow I would leave this place. And this time I would not leave as a shadow, as a ghost. I would leave as myself, with my name, my voice, and the freedom I had reclaimed.